It was George Michael, of course.
He was my rival. He was called George. You know, he made soul music. So we had so much in common. But, you know, I suppose our egos wouldn't allow us to really be friends.
He didn't say it loudly. He didn't announce it on stage or hide it behind the sharp wit he'd used for decades. Boy George was 64 when he finally spoke the sentence that froze the room. A sentence that confirmed what fans had whispered for years. That something between him and George Michael had never healed. And when he said it, there was no sarcasm, no glitter, no makeup, no costume to buffer the truth. Just a quiet voice and a wound that had clearly been waiting a lifetime to breathe. Because for years, the world believed their feud was just campy banter, two icons trading playful jabs for headlines and laughs. But the truth, as Boy George finally admitted, was colder, sharper, and born from a moment he never spoke about. A moment that changed how he looked at George Michael forever. Some say the resentment began in a dressing room in the mid-'80s, a whispered comment backstage, overheard but never addressed. Others claim it started long before that, when two young men, both fighting their way out of the same cultural shadows, realized they were being compared to each other in ways neither of them could control. These theories, these rumors, they were always shadows trailing behind them, never confirmed, never denied. Not until now. Because when Boy George finally revealed the truth, he didn't talk about jealousy. He didn't talk about fame. He didn't talk about the competition the tabloids love to fuel. He talked about something much quieter, much more painful. He talked about a wound, one he had carried in silence, even after George Michael was gone. A wound he once thought he'd buried deep enough to forget, but could never quite outrun. He said, "People thought it was all jokes, but it never was, not to me." And suddenly, the decades of interviews, sarcasm, and defensive laughter made sense in a way they never had before. Because the truth wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't a headline waiting to happen. The truth was something he had kept to himself because it hurt too much to admit. And now, finally, he was ready to tell the world why. It didn't happen all at once. Resentment rarely does. It arrives in fragments, in looks that last a second too long, in compliments that don't sound like compliments, in silences that swallow the air between two people who should understand each other but never truly do. For Boy George and George Michael, that tension grew in the shadows of green rooms where makeup mirrors hummed and stylists whispered behind half-closed doors. Even in the early days, long before the headlines, long before the feud had a name, people noticed how the air changed when the two of them were in the same hallway. Not hostility, not hatred, just something. Something tight, something cold, something neither of them ever addressed. There were nights when both men performed on the same TV circuit. George Michael polished and immaculate. Boy George bold and unapologetically flamboyant. Two different planets orbiting the same sun. Two different definitions of what it meant to be a pop star, a queer icon, a man. Some crew members claimed, quietly, cautiously, that backstage, Boy George would glance toward George Michael's dressing room with a look that wasn't jealousy, but wasn't admiration either. A look that said, "I know what they expect from us, and I won't be who they want me to be." Meanwhile, George Michael, ever the perfectionist, ever the diplomat, kept his eyes lowered, his focus on rehearsal schedules and the coming avalanche of press demands. The world saw two rising legends, but behind closed doors, they were two young men navigating fame, identity, and pressure in completely different ways. And sometimes those differences cut deeper than anyone realized. There was a conversation one Boy George alluded to for years without naming. A conversation that fans still debate, that insiders still refer to in cautious whispers. A moment behind the studio door where something was said or left unsaid that neither man ever forgot. Boy George later hinted that it wasn't an insult. It wasn't a joke taken too far. It was something more subtle, something that pierced exactly where he was most vulnerable at the time. A comparison, a suggestion, a small remark that carried the full weight of an industry that constantly pitted them against each other. Whether intentional or accidental, George Michael had touched a nerve Boy George wasn't ready to reveal to the world. And George, guarded and private, never realized how deeply the moment cut, or how silently the resentment grew. This was the part they never spoke about on camera. This was the fracture fans didn't see happening, not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet. The kind of quiet that lingers, the kind that festers. There were recording nights where Boy George would hear a new George Michael single playing through studio walls. Flawless vocals, perfect harmonies, the kind of precision that came from discipline and control. Two things Boy George in those turbulent years didn't always have. And perhaps the hardest part wasn't that George Michael succeeded. It was that he succeeded in a way Boy George couldn't imitate, couldn't mock, couldn't turn into comedy. It was a mirror, one he didn't want to look into. By the late 80s, their paths rarely crossed, but the tension was unmistakable when they did. Outwardly polite, inwardly brittle, eyes that didn't meet, smiles that didn't reach, comments that landed just a little too close to the bone. Fans thought the feud was playful, a rivalry performed for the cameras. But the truth, as Boy George hinted decades later, was far more fragile than fame ever allowed him to say. Because sometimes the deepest wounds don't come from cruelty. They come from misunderstanding, from identity, from seeing in someone else the parts of yourself you're terrified to confront. And Boy George had carried that wound, quietly, almost stubbornly, for a lifetime. There comes a moment in every quiet feud when the silence becomes louder than the words that started it. For Boy George and George Michael, that moment arrived long before the public ever noticed, long before fans began choosing sides, long before the playful interviews became barbed. It didn't look dramatic, not on the surface. It wasn't an argument exploding in a backstage corridor or a headline-making insult tossed across a TV studio. It was something much simpler and much more devastating. It was the moment Boy George realized that George Michael wasn't playing the same game anymore. For years, Boy George had used humor as his armor, sarcasm, flamboyance, wit sharp enough to cut through the noise. But as George Michael grew into global superstardom, becoming quieter, more serious, more deliberate in every move, Boy George felt the ground shift beneath him. Not because George Michael had changed, but because the world changed around him. There was one particular night, a charity event in London in the late 80s, when everything crystallized. Boy George had performed earlier in the evening, a vibrant, unpredictable set that left the audience laughing, cheering, alive. But when George Michael took the stage later that night, the room transformed completely. The cheers softened into reverent silence. The lights dimmed into something intimate, sacred. And as George sang flawlessly, effortlessly, Boy George felt something he never admitted until decades later. He felt small, not overshadowed, not defeated, just exposed. Like George Michael was everything the industry wanted, clean, polished, palatable, while Boy George was everything it feared, loud, complicated, too hard to manage. He watched from the side curtains, arms crossed, trying not to show the sting rising in his chest. And when George walked past him afterward, offering a polite nod, maybe even a small smile, Boy George snapped. Not outwardly, no one saw it. But inside, a door shut. A door that stayed shut for decades. That was the breaking point. Not because of what George did, but because of what Boy George felt and couldn't admit, not even to himself. In later interviews, Boy George hinted at this night without naming it. He mentioned feeling misunderstood, compared, pushed aside. He joked it off, laughed it away, turned it into entertainment. But resentment rarely laughs. It lingers. And so the feud, unspoken, unaddressed, quiet enough to ignore but deep enough to wound, solidified right there in the shadows of that stage. For George Michael, it was just another performance. For Boy George, it was the moment he felt the world had chosen between them. After that night, their interactions became colder, less frequent, more brittle around the edges. At interviews, Boy George's jokes about George Michael became sharper, more barbed, tinged with something the public called shade, but insiders recognized immediately as pain. He mocked George's image, his seriousness, his perfection, because it hurt to acknowledge what George had become in the public eye. A symbol, a standard, a star boy. George knew he could never mirror. And George? He never confronted him, never pushed back, never asked the question Boy George was waiting, sometimes desperately, to be asked. Why are you angry with me? But George Michael was private, guarded, and when things hurt him, he hid them behind silence. Boy. George hid his behind noise, two men coping in opposite ways, never meeting in the middle. And the world watched a feud grow that neither of them ever meant to begin. A feud they never resolved. Not until Boy George turned 64 and finally spoke the words that explained everything. For most of his life, Boy George carried the feud like a story he could never quite finish, a sentence left hanging mid-air. He turned it into humor, into a form of theater, into something the public could laugh at, so they wouldn't look too closely at what lay beneath. But time has a way of softening the edges of our defenses, and grief has a way of making us say the quiet things aloud. When George Michael died in 2016, something shifted inside Boy George, something he didn't publicly acknowledge but could no longer hide. The jokes stopped, the playful digs disappeared. The rivalry that once felt like a safe place to channel insecurity suddenly became a wound he could no longer pretend wasn't there. And for the first time, Boy George faced the one truth he had avoided for decades. The feud was never really about George Michael. It was about himself. In interviews shortly after George Michael's passing, fans noticed a change. A softness in Boy George's voice, a vulnerability that felt almost foreign coming from him. He no longer spoke about George Michael as a rival. He spoke about him as someone he once understood more deeply than anyone else, even if neither of them ever admitted it. He said things that made fans pause, rewind the clip, listen again, because for the first time, the sarcasm wasn't hiding anything. There was one moment in particular when Boy George's voice dipped to almost a whisper. He was more like me than I ever wanted to admit. It was the closest he had ever come to acknowledging the truth beneath their silence, that the tension between them was never just about fame or personality or the colorful barbs traded in interviews. It was about seeing a version of himself that frightened him. People often assume rivalries come from hatred, but Boy George revealed that his resentment didn't come from anything George Michael did. It came from the way he saw himself reflected in George's success. George Michael was confident but quiet, controlled but deeply emotional. A perfectionist who hid his inner battles behind immaculate vocals and a polished calm. Boy George, by contrast, lived his chaos out loud. He wore his rebellion, his flamboyance, his insecurities on his sleeves, in his hair, in his voice. And yet, underneath it all, they were two young gay men trying to survive an industry that didn't want them to be fully themselves. Boy George would later confess, "George handled it in a way I couldn't, and I resented him for it." Not because George Michael did anything wrong, but because George did something Boy George couldn't. He made the world love him without ever showing how much it cost. That quiet strength became the mirror Boy George avoided looking into for decades. When Boy George finally reached the age of 64, he sat down for a quiet interview. No grand stage, no theatrical lighting, just a man ready to let go. And he said the words that changed everything fans thought they knew. It was never him, it was me. I didn't know how to deal with my own feelings. He explained how their infamous backstage moment, the one fans still speculate about, wasn't a blow-up or an insult or a deliberate slight. It was a misunderstanding, a single remark that George Michael probably didn't think twice about, but one that cut into a place Boy George wasn't ready to reveal. The wound wasn't the comment. It was the silence that followed. The silence that Boy George filled with stories, with assumptions, with fears that grew louder as the years passed. He joked in interviews because joking felt safer than admitting how deeply the moment had shaped him. He mocked George Michael's image because mocking felt safer than admitting that he admired him, envied him, and couldn't understand why their connection never blossomed into friendship. And the saddest part, Boy George admitted, was that George Michael may never have known there was anything to fix. And then came the confession that fans had waited decades to hear. The one he didn't say out of bitterness, but out of release. I wish I'd told him I respected him. I wish I'd told him we were more alike than I ever let on. It was a moment of profound vulnerability, a crack in the armor of a man who spent his whole life performing strength. He admitted that he had wanted George Michael to confront him, to ask him, to acknowledge the tension. But George, ever the private soul, chose silence instead. A silence boy. George interpreted as dismissal, when in truth it was George's own shield, his own form of self-preservation. And so the distance between them grew, quietly, invisibly, until it hardened into a wound neither of them ever tended to. At 64, Boy George put the feud to rest in the only way he could, by naming the wound that had lived inside him since those early days of fame. I wasn't angry at him, he said. I was angry at myself. He represented everything I wished I could be. The confession wasn't just about George Michael. It was about the young Boy George, lost in fame, drowning in expectation, using humor as a shield against a world that didn't understand him. He finally forgave George Michael, not because George asked for it, but because Boy George finally understood that the wound was never his to give. It belonged to the younger version of himself, the version he can finally let rest. If this chapter of music history touched you, if this quiet confession stayed with you, there are more untold stories waiting here. Stories of wounds never spoken, rivalries that shaped generations, and the emotional truths hidden behind the greatest voices of all time. Subscribe to RetroWaves and let us keep unraveling the secrets that shaped the legends.